So what is the next step? Well, I really originally thought that we would get a square on the screen, and that's what we should work towards. Let's get a square on the screen. But before we do that, we're going to need to know how to use priorities. So let's really quick create a situation to demonstrate how priorities work. Looking at all of our existing constraints, we can see that they all have a priority of 1000, which, as you remember, means required. That means auto layout will do everything possible to make it happen. So what happens then when two things that have an equal priority seem to be telling auto layout to be doing different things? Let's go ahead and create that situation. Let's pick one of our constraints. Let's say this one on the right edge, and instead of 50, let's set it to be 100. Great, and that works fine. So that brings in our margin to be twice as wide on this side. But now imagine that we add back the constraint that tells it that we want our object to be horizontally centered. So let's just go ahead and add that. Oops, we didn't select the view. So let's go ahead and select the view, and we go to our alignment menu. And let's tell it we want it to be horizontally centered in the container. Let's check that and add that constraint. And now you see some interesting things. So these didn't usually tell us their numbers, but now we can see we've got 50, 0, and 100. So it's trying to tell us that something is wrong. In the preview, nothing has changed. We still have a spacing of 100 over here. We still have 50 over here. Maybe that's kind of what it's trying to tell us right here. It's saying, hey, you said to be centered, but these two sides are different. We'll also look over here. We can see that that red arrow is back. So let's click in there. And now, before we had missing constraints, now we have conflicting constraints. And you can see that even though we just added one, we actually have a constraint across these three items. If any one of these items is taken away, it solves the problem. Now we can see that if we click on, say, the one we set to 100, and if we uninstall it. So now remember, when it's uninstalled, auto layout acts like it's not there. But if we install it again, the error comes back. And we can see the same thing if we uninstall this one, or if we uninstall this one. And you'll notice in this case that if we uninstall the one for the left-hand side, then now it's taking our cue from the right-hand side and from the central alignment to decide that both sides should be 100 in from the margin. But instead of just uninstalling one, let's add it back and just handle these conflicts using priorities. So how can priorities help us here? Now, remember, we have a conflict because right now, all three of these constraints have a priority of required. But what happens if we change one? So we've gone back to where the left side is 50 and the right side is 100. So with the right side selected, if we change our priority, let's drop it down to high. Okay, so we've noticed that doing that resolved our issue. We no longer have a conflict, and it's switched into the same form as if we had uninstalled it. You'll also notice that in our main view here, our right eye bar stayed the same, but our left eye bar changed. This is the one that we changed the priority on. So this is a visual cue that Xcode gives you to let you know that not all of your constraints are required. This one has a lower priority and may not always apply. So the reason why we ended up in this shape is because now auto layout knows that it's more important to us that we be 100 away from the margin and centered than it is to be 50 away from the edge on the left. But then what happens if we select the one on the right and we change that priority? So we can't go any higher than 1000, and we know that the one on the left is 750. So then what if we make this one even lower? All right, so now the constraint on the left side has a higher priority. So now auto layout's saying, okay, it's more important to be 50 away from the edge and centered. Really, in order, now it knows that the most important thing is to be centered. After that, try to be 50 away from the leading edge. Then, after that, if it's still possible, be 100 away from the right edge. Well, that last one's not possible without invalidating one of the other two, so it gets left out. You'll also notice here that now both I-bars are dashed, just to let us know that they both have priorities other than 1,000. Now, does it have to be 250 and 750 and 1,000? No. It could be any number that we want to type in. So here we can say instead, we still want it to be less than the other. We could go 749. No change. But if we bump it up to 750, now we have a conflict again because now they're both the same. And if we bump it up one more to 751, now this one's winning again. Now we still have a misplaced view warning over here, but that's, again, just telling us that it wants this view to be slightly different. You can see the dotted line right there. It's very subtle on the red, and the dotted line right over here. But we don't need to update that right now because we're just going to remove these conflicting constraints. This is just for demonstration purposes. In this situation, it doesn't really have a purpose other than to show you how auto layout chooses which constraint to go with. But there will be other situations and slightly more complicated setups where the priority matters more, like when you have constraints that you want to be less than or equal to some value, and it needs to know, should it be less than or should it be equal to? And then it can sort of look at the other constraints and their priorities and find the best fit that matches all of those constraints. So let's go ahead and return back out, exit out of there, and we want to make a square now. So first let's delete that conflicting restraint. So let's go ahead and get rid of that center X. We'll just delete it. And let's go ahead and change this back to 50 just so that we're back to where we started before. Oh, and it looks like you can see right here and right here that I actually forgot to change my priorities back. So we can just select that over here and set it back to required. And again, you can go any number here between 1,000 and 0. In a lot of cases, it's totally fine to just do required, high, and low, but if you have maybe a handful of priorities that are sort of in the high range, but they need to be ranked in order of priority relative to each other, that's when you could do something like 755, 740, 700, and things like that. It just allows you a lot of flexibility within that range of 1,000 to make sure that you have enough options to get everything into the exact priority order that you want. So let's go back to required. And we want to do the same thing for the spacing on the other side. Great. So we're back to required priorities on everything, 50 away from the edges. Fantastic. So now, how do we turn this into an actual square?